All right. Bon, bonne fin d'après-midi. Hey. So we're going to continue. This is our last talk of the day. So this is pretty much the end of the conference. After that, there was supposed to be a picnic afterwards. I don't know what will happen with that. I'm pretty sure that the organizer will come and discuss it with you guys after. But for now, let's focus on our friend Stefan Artinian, who's a leadership coach, and personal development coach. And he coached entrepreneurs from various countries. I remember from memory, USA, Germany, I think France, Italy, Spain, all these that. He also speaks a bunch of languages, English, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, German, Armenian, and Neapolitan. So his talk is about the fact that up until recently it was assumed that our brain freezes over time. You know that we become static and we lose our neuroplasticity. But now we know that it's not true anymore. And Stefan is going to share with us 6 of his insights that he considers being very important to help us learn better, and that implies, of course, languages. All right.
Great. Thank you. Oh, hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Kind of a hard act to follow, Michael, his talk. I'm not an actor, but I'll do my best to keep you entertained, make this interesting. I'm going to talk about 6 insights about the brain, and that have come out of our, understanding neuroscience, particularly about neuroplasticity. I'm going to talk about that, and brief overview of these 6 key insights, without going into a whole lot of detail, because we're talking about the brain, which is probably I would arguably the most complex thing in the known universe. And then I will go over some of the implications for learning, and particularly for language learning. So first, a little bit about me. So again, my name is Stephen Artinian. I'm from New York. I'm a professional coach, and I was trained in something called brain-based coaching, which applies finding some neuroscience to the area of human development, goal setting. And I studied, so I'm not a scientist, but I studied at a place called the NeuroLeadership Institute in New York, which was founded by an Australian named David Rock. And actually, it's David Rock who came up with these 6 insights, not me. He reviewed a great body of research done by, many scientists from many countries, and he took this great body of knowledge and he condensed it into 6 key insights about the brain that kind of change everything. So these are the six key insights, and I'm going to go over each one of them in a bit of a brief overview of each one, and then we'll look at some of the practical implications. So the first insight is that our brain is a connection machine. And Christopher was mentioned before that, gave you a brief overview that until fairly recently, about the last 20 years, the brain was thought to be static. So the brain didn't basically, once you reached adulthood, the brain basically didn't change anymore. We all knew that the child's brain was extremely plastic, but we thought once you became an adult, that the brain no longer formed new connections, and it was kind of like downhill from there. Well, it turns out that that's not true at all. The brain actually forms new connections throughout our lives. This actually happens until we take our last breath. Now, that's not to say the adult brain has the same level of plasticity as a child's brain. A child's brain is far more plastic than an adult brain. But the fact is that the adult brain continues to form these new neural connections throughout our lives. And what happens is based on our thoughts, based on our emotions, based on what we do every day, our brain actually changes its form and structure based on how we think and how we feel. And this is basically called neuroplasticity. And actually, the intrinsic function of the brain is to make connections between, it's forming these maps of the world. Every one of us basically forms this maps and maps nested within maps, and maps of those maps, and and it forms associations between these things. And so every time we learn something new, we're making a connection between the new bit of knowledge that we're learning, we're mapping that to our existing knowledge. So we learn through associations. And that's, so basically, every thought you've ever had, every emotion you've ever had, every experience you've ever had, it all's encoded in your brain in this series of like incredibly complex maps. And this is, there are actually, physical and chemical changes that occur when these maps are being formed. And it's actually the brain's favorite activity, is to form connections. The brain loves to do this. It's constantly regenerating itself, forming these connections. It makes millions of them every single second. And it also feels good when we make connections. The brain likes to do this, and I'm going to get into feeling good and being in a toward state, and that's why that's really important for learning. As we go on. So we know the brain makes all these connections, and it's mapping the unique experience you've had in your life. It's creating this series of maps. Oh, and during this talk, I'm going to use different words. I might say maps. We could call it hardwiring. We could call it pathways, associations, connections. They all really mean the same thing. Words tend to be like loaded. Some people don't like some words, so just use the word that feels right for you. A lot of times, I think it's interesting because the words that we used are influenced by the era we're living in. So back in the 19th century when there were, some of the revolutionary ideas about psychology, they started to make comparisons with like the steam engine, tension building up. Now we tend to use the computer. Right, so I'm saying hardwiring, but obviously in the brain, it's not really hardwired. We're talking about living organism. So it's far more complex than any computer. But I'm just using hardwiring as a metaphor I think we can all understand. So basically, since each one of us is making this unique set of connections every second of our lives, and it's forming these new neural maps, what it means is that up close, no two brains are the same. Every single brain is unique. There's a neuroscientist named John Ratey, and according to John Ratey, there are more ways of connecting the neurons in the human brain than there are atoms in the known universe, which is like a mind-boggling concept. There are 300 trillion dynamic connections in constant flux in the human brain. As I said, it's the most complex thing in the known universe. So what this means is that there are really unlimited possibilities of the way we experience the world. Now, when I talk about no brains being the same, obviously there are certain things, many things are the same. When we're talking about relatively simple things, like moving your leg or moving your hand or breathing, which are not simple, but in relative to some other brain functions they are, those neural circuits look the same for all of us. They're similar. But when you get down to the deeper levels, like your motivation, your belief system, your life experience, the habits you have, how you perceive the world, at that level, at that subtle level, every single one of us is different. We each have like a unique set of neural pathways. So, why does the brain do this? So the brain basically, it hardwires everything that it can. So you might ask yourself, why does the brain do all this hardwiring? So first of all, when we think about the brain, we tend to think of the thinking part of our brain, which is the prefrontal cortex. That's the part that makes us human. It's what distinguishes us from other animals. It's actually the brain region that developed most recently. It's interesting, since we're among polyglots here, the word cortex actually means bark, comes from Latin, and it's a sheet of, and it's called cortex because what it is, it's like a sheet of very thin bark that covers the top of our cranium and kind of protects the other areas. And the prefrontal cortex is a part of the neocortex, and it's located just behind our foreheads. And this is where basically most things that we associate with being human take place. Thinking, learning, working memory, but it only accounts for about 5% of the area of our total brain, maybe even less than 5%. However, it's an energy sink. It consumes a lot of energy. It consumes a lot of glucose and it consumes a lot of oxygen. So basically what the brain does is anytime it perceives a behavior that's repetitive or habitual and says, hey, I recognize this, you do this a lot. Okay, it pushes that down to these more primitive brain systems, which are called the precortical brain systems that are like the limbic system, systems that actually predate our species. And it pushes those things down, and it hardwires them. And it does this to conserve energy, because the prefrontal cortex consumes a lot of energy, and since real estate in the brain is very, it's costly, the brain is like, okay, you do this all the time, I'm just going to hardwire this so I don't have to think about it anymore. And that's how we form habits. It's kind of like it's like a well-worn path in the forest, and we're really good at this, at doing this kind of thing, at forming these new habits. I mean, evolution has programmed us to do this, and we're like extraordinarily good at it. And it's very useful. I mean, I'll give you a metaphor of an example of when this happened. So when I was a boy. In the wintertime, we would go sledding. So I grew up in upstate New York, and it's pretty cold. Not as cold as here, but it's cold. And in the winter, it would snow, and we would get our sleds, and we would go to we'd find a nice hill, and to go sledding. And when we would get to that hill, the snow would be fresh, virgin white snow, and we were excited. We'd get on our sleds, and we'd go down. And the first few times you went down, the sled would basically go any which way. It was really easy to steer the sled. It could go this way, it could go that way. But like the third, the fourth time, pretty soon, without you realizing it, the sled started going down the same way every time, because there was like a rut that you formed in the snow. And the sled did that because it's easier. And that's basically what our brains do. Our brains basically kind of default to this, this track that it already recognized because it's easy. And that's why creating a new habit is not an easy thing to do. It's hard. The brain doesn't want to do it. The brain is like, I don't want to do this. It's too much work. It's too much energy. So that's why forming a new habit requires work. So, that's basically why the brain, it does this hardwiring. Now, the hardwiring, so what it does is it drives our automatic perception. It drives how we perceive the world. Right? This is actually how biases are formed. I think over 200 different types of bias have been identified. We all have biases, and I think the word has negative connotations, but it's not really negative. It just really reflects our experience of our personal life experience. But these deep rooted pathways basically determine. So the way we see the world is not really the way the world is. We see the world the way we are. That's how we perceive the world. And this is really driven by our hardwiring, and this all occurs outside of our perception. I don't know. I think a good analysis when we look at the human brain, the thinking part that we recognize, like working memory, where learning takes place. If you think of an iceberg, it's the tip of the iceberg is above the water, but what happens in the brain, the vast majority of it is under the water level. You don't see it. It's not conscious. That's really, when people say, because it's a myth when people say we only use 5% of our brain. It's not that we can become like a superhuman, like in a lot of like science fiction movies. But there is an element of truth, right? That so much of what's going on in our brain we're not aware of, and I think that's really where the idea comes from. We're not aware of what's going on below the surface. So if you think of an iceberg, that kind of gives you the idea. So. Once this wiring has been laid down, it's almost impossible to deconstruct it. So there was a neuroscientist named Hebbs that was, he was so good they actually named a law after him, Hebbs Law. And what Hebbs Law basically says is that neurons that fire together wire together. And what that means is that two neurons that fire together repeatedly. If they do that long enough, on a continuous basis, what happens is there are chemical changes that occur in both neurons that cause them to link more strongly in the future. And that's how those neural pathways are formed because of Hebbs laws. So learning tends to link the neurons in new ways. And if we continue to repeat something over and over again, we're forming this new neural pathway. So that's great. However, what that also means is that if we try to eliminate a problem by focusing on the problem, it tends to reinforce the existing neural pathways. There's Jeffrey Schwartz actually did, he's a psychologist, and he calls this brain lock. Brain lock is basically when certain circuits are just, in fact, some psychological disorders like obsessive compulsive disorder is related to this concept of brain lock, where basically, in fact, people who suffer from that, there are actually certain, I forget which regions of the brain, it's like they're permanently switched on. And the solution for this kind of thing is not to focus on the problem. You have to really put your attention somewhere else, which is really focusing on the solution. It sounds kind of like, pop psychology, but isn't. If you focus on the problem, you tend to reinforce the problem. It also is why beliefs are really important. If you have a negative belief, I'm too old to learn how to play tennis or something, and if you believe that, then that's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And you're just going to be, every time you repeat that to yourself, you're reinforcing this existing wiring. And again, trying to change our existing wiring is a bit like trying to, imagine a trail in the forest. If there's a trail in the forest, the first time you make that trail, it's a lot of work. Like I said, making a habit is work. But after a while, the trail becomes very, every time you go into the forest, you start walking down the same trail, and it gets easier and easier to do that. So if you want to change a habit, the implication here is rather than trying to cover up that trail, which could be a tremendous amount of work, and you might not even be able to do it, there might always be a trace left, it's easier to make a new trail. So that's the whole idea of not focusing on the problem. It's like, forget the old trail, create a new trail. And so the good news is that though it's almost impossible to deconstruct the old wiring, it's really easy to create new wiring. And the brain loves doing that. The brain loves creating new wiring. And that's why I said, focusing on the solution rather than the problem. You're creating new pathways in the brain. It's kind of like trying to deviate the course of a river. It's a tremendous amount of work. It's not going to be successful. Or if you do want to, it's a lot maybe more efficient to build a canal and have the water find its own way. And that's really what creating this new wiring is about. And the way we create new wiring is basically by, attention and repetition and reward. Some of these themes have come up in various talks today. We did a yoga class today, and they're talking about rewarding yourself. That's really important about rewarding yourself. We talked about, attention. When it comes to learning in the long-term learning, we have to make a distinction between the ability to recall something and the ability to retain something. Like if you take a multiple choice test, you can recall you can recognize, but recall is when basically you're able to come up with the right answer without an external prompt. Okay, and in order to have that happen, you really need, focused attention. To create new wiring, you need to focus your attention. The more your attention is focused, you activate the hippocampus. And when you activate the hippocampus, that's where long-term memories are. The hippocampus is fundamental. If you don't have a hippocampus, you can't remember anything. I mean, literally, absolutely nothing. If that, and this is, unfortunately, there are people in that condition, they have no memory. It's almost like they're not human. They can't remember anything. So, we can create new wiring in our brains. So, what is, did I skip a slide here? No. So that was like a really rapid overview of these, these key 6 insights. As I said, the brain is extremely complex. But, so, what does that all mean? What does that mean for us? What does that mean for, for learning? What does it mean for language learning? So the first implication is that age is not a barrier to learning a language. As I said, the brain changes its structure through very thought and activity. Now again, a lot of times people talk about children being better language learners than adults. I think that's probably true, that children are better language learners, but I don't really think that's the question. I think what's really important is, I think a lot of people think that adults, there's some kind of barrier, you can't learn, or your performance deteriorates. I think those of us here know that's not the case. I mean, I'm a better language learner. I'm 55. I'm a better language learner than when I was 25. But I think, though, among the general, I'm going to use the term general public, the non-crazy, people like us who are polyglots, a lot of people believe, this is a very common belief, I'm too old, I can't learn. It's simply not true. It's not true because, this is what your brain does. It's forming, new connections, and that's exactly what you're doing, especially when you're learning a new language. You're creating new neural pathways. You're creating a new representation of the world. People have talked about, Michael talked about how in a way he becomes a different person. In a way, it's kind of consistent with this, right? I mean, you're engaging new brain circuits because it's all affecting how you're perceiving the reality. And so through this new language, you're perceiving reality in a different way. I mean, it's actually interesting to note that, studies have shown, or at least there's one study that I know of at I think it was the University of Haifa in Israel. They actually, under controlled circumstances, adults actually beat the children in language learning. They're actually better than the children. So I think it also depends on what kind of learning we're talking about. If we go out of the realm of language learning and we look at people who practice meditation, people who practice meditation on a long-term basis, their brains change. They actually have the amygdala. The amygdala is a region, a very ancient part of our brain that's really, you may have heard of this, it's the center of the fight or flight response. People who meditate, it's been shown that their amygdalas are smaller. And the prefrontal cortex is slightly more, a little bit thicker, people who meditate. So meditation changes your brain. And this has been shown, through, physically, it's been shown scientifically. I talk about stroke victims, and the reason I bring that up is because I think the biggest breakthroughs in neuroscience have been made through helping stroke victims. A lot of these findings came, like many things in science or in life, you're studying one thing and you discover something else. And so with stroke, especially looking at people's before and after rehabilitation. Because, again, if you go back to the old way of thinking about the brain, there was something called localization. Like, for example, sensory localization, that the sensory functions were localized. There's a particular brain area that's responsible for speech, and a particular brain area that's responsible for vision. That's true. There are particular brain areas on those things that are specialized in that. However, that's not carved in stone. If a person, which is exactly what happens in a stroke, suffers a catastrophic brain injury, where that brain region becomes damaged beyond repair, it turns out that other brain regions can be trained to take over that job. It's like they have backups. They might not be quite as good at it, but they can take over that job. And so, for example, there's one of the pioneers was a gentleman named Edward Taub, and he has a pretty famous rehabilitation center in Atlanta, Georgia, where he works with stroke victims. And he helps people to regain balance, regain use of a limb, regain their speech, just all this incredible stuff. And what he does is they do, and he uses something called constraint-induced therapy. I won't go into the details of that, but they've done brain imaging of these people before and after the therapy. And what's fascinating is that after the therapy, there are brain regions that are activated that weren't activated before. Or another great example, there was a Mexican-American neuroscientist, Paul Bach-Irita, who's passed away, unfortunately. He was also a polyglot, interestingly enough, and he made all these discoveries just working with his dad. I mean, his dad got a stroke, and no one could help him, so he decided, I'm going to help him. And he actually helped his father to recover, just kind of experimenting. He actually invented a device that helped congenitally blind people to regain some sense of sight. And what he did is, well, the original device was developed in the 60s, but, and it was a massive thing. It was like strapped to like a dentist chair. But now they've really reduced it, thanks to technology. And by basically placing this like little sensor on a person's tongue, and the sensory sensations that are captured by the tongue function like pixels. And the person can actually perceive, they don't have perfect eyesight, but they actually can perceive depth. They can actually make out shapes. They can perceive, the distance of something just through sensations on their tongue. And the conclusion was, well, do we really see with our eyes? Or is it that we're seeing with our brains? So, my message here is that, if stroke patients can do these remarkable things, there's no question that this idea that you're too old to learn a language, even if we all know that, but if you're talking to your friends when you leave this conference, there's a lot of science showing that that's absolutely not the case. And another example is the Broca area. You've probably heard about the Broca area associated with speech, and it was thought to be fundamental to being able to talk. But it turns out there are people who don't have a Broca area, or it's been totally eroded because the left hemisphere of the brain has decayed, but they can still talk. Well, how do you explain that if the Broca area is so fundamental? Because there's sensory substitution. And we're just at the beginning of this. We're learning, we're really in the infancy, so I can only imagine what, my grandchildren will be talking about. Other studies have showed that language learning is a good, there's a little bit of controversy about that, but quite a few studies have showed that it's an excellent prevention of early onset dementia. I think this is a myth that really, can be debunked about, age being a barrier. Up until now, I've been talking about how language learning is, or about neuroplasticity and how it's, how phenomenal it is. It's characteristic. It enables us to do incredible things. And that's no doubt, that's true. If we use our brains the right way, if we're cognizant of this, we can continue to grow throughout our lives. The problem is, it's really a double-edged sword, because the neuroplasticity, while it allows us to grow, it also tends to make us be stagnant. Because as I said before, once we form these circuits, they're really, once they've been laid down, they're hard to change. So the neuroplasticity can basically reinforce itself, right? Just because reinforcing the bad habit. And the reason this is that, our brain wasn't designed to make us happy. We think that, we all want to be happy. It wasn't designed to make us happy. It was designed to make us survive. Because, what the brain does is it divides the world into, or the primitive, the limbic system divides the world into rewards and threats, things that are good or bad. If it's, but unfortunately, it gives more importance to the threats. And I'm going to talk about that, a bit later. But we tend to focus on the negative, and being biased towards the negative can tend to reinforce some of these not really helpful habits. So another finding is interesting. I imagine a lot of you are familiar with the work of Stephen Krashen, the linguist. He was here last year. The input hypothesis. I'm certainly not an expert in the input hypothesis, but the basic idea is that we acquire language rather than learn it, and we acquire it through natural means, unconsciously, and basically we do that through meaningful interaction in the target language, primarily through input, through comprehensible input that's interesting, and key point, in a low anxiety situation. Now, this is I think this understanding is largely consistent. I think the input hypothesis is largely consistent with what we know about the brain. Because, well, first of all, as I mentioned before, if the material is really interesting, or even compelling, as Stephen Krashen, it says it should be, it tends to maximize our attention. If we're riveted to it, to this, to the content, well, we're activating the hippocampus again, and when the hippocampus is activated, we tend to develop these long-term memories. The same time, the kind of the low anxiety environment, not the school testing environment, but the environment where you really engage with people, you really want to understand what they're saying, or you're listening to a story, and we're relaxed. That's also very, very good, and the reason why is because there's something called the Goldilocks mix. Okay, so there are two. When we're moving towards something we want, okay, when we're moving towards a goal that we want, our brain generates dopamine, which is the chemical of interest. We want something. And actually, it turns out that that's really good for learning. The more dopamine we have, the wider our field of perception, the better our cognition, the more likely we are to cooperate with other people. We try out new things, take risks. We're motivated towards something. At the same time, there's noradrenaline, which is basically it's the chemical of alertness. Okay, because if we're totally relaxed, we're not motivated at all. We want to have some neuroadrenaline. So the Goldilocks mix, and this has actually been studied in many studies, have shown there's actually kind of like an optimal balance between you want a little bit of neuroadrenaline, but not too much where you're totally stressed out. But you want enough to keep you motivated, but you also want a lot of dopamine. And in fact, this, what I think is really interesting is I think that this is very consistent with the input hypothesis, because you're kind of getting automatically this Goldilocks mix. It's also related to the concept of flow state. A flow state is also, some people call it the zone. Flow state could be characterized as that state of mind when you're doing something. I think we've all experienced this. When you're doing something, and you're so engrossed in the thing that you're doing, you're so something that you like doing, that you lose all sense of time. You're performing without making any effort. Okay, you don't feel hungry. You're just totally in the moment and totally present. This is called flow state. Professional athletes, this is the state they want to be in. You could tell when a tennis player is in the zone. When a tennis player is in the zone, everyone knows. You can just tell they're hot, right? They're in the zone. And it seems like it's almost like they're performing without trying. Interesting to know when the player starts to realize, I'm doing great, and they start trying, then they mess up. They kind of leave the zone, And it's interesting. A great book about this is The Inner Game of Tennis. I don't know if you've ever heard it. It's a great book about. It's about tennis, but it's about much more than tennis. It's really about life in general. This kind of flow state, this area of peak performance, is actually where I think that the comprehensible input approach actually tends to cultivate this flow state. So I think it's very consistent. Another interesting thing to know about the flow state is that when we're in this state, our brain produces, depending on what we're doing or the time of day, it generates different kinds of brain waves, different frequencies. When we're in flow state, our brain generates alpha brain waves. And the alpha brain waves are, when we're feeling kind of like relaxed, but not too relaxed. We're relaxed, but we're present. We're in the moment. And this is really that peak performance state. It's also the state that's the best state for learning. We have, again, wider perception. Our cognition improves. When people are stressed, when you're stressed, you don't perform as well. The prefrontal cortex goes offline when you're stressed. I mean, I participated in a training program, kind of like this boot camp training program, and they really stressed us. I mean, we had people in like black suits screaming at us, and then they gave us like a mathematical exam to do, and then they tested our cortisol levels, and they did the same test the next day where it was like an opposite environment, and your performance falls off dramatically, in direct correlation to your cortisol levels. So the stress basically takes your PFC offline. So. So I think this, one caveat to this though is that I also think that the output is also very important for, probably I think, I don't even think this is inconsistent with what Stephen Krashen is saying, but I think the output, to create long-term memories, you also have to generate. And the generation requires you to put things into your own words, to say things, to say it to someone else, to write it down, put it into your own words. When you take the information that you've learned and you make it meaningful for yourself, which involves some kind of generation, that also reinforces a long-term recall. So another implication is that self-directed learning is really the best kind of learning for most things. There's really no one right method, and it's because our brains are all different. We don't all have the same brain. Everyone has a different learning style and different way of making associations. It's also interesting that our attention tends to be maximized if we change learning styles. Novelty increases dopamine. I suspect that maybe one of the reasons a lot of polyglots like to learn a lot of different languages, is just my theory, or jump from one language to another, is it increases dopamine levels. Because, but you know, I think, yeah. So novelty definitely raises dopamine levels, and just in general, you know, you're more motivated when you set your own agenda. You know, when you set your own agenda, you're more likely to, you know, retain what you learn. This is also very consistent with what Stephen Krashen says. I think the key for the output is if you're doing the output when at your own pace. If someone's forcing you to do it, then it creates that threat state. So it's basically you have to do it at your own pace, at your own speed, and you're more motivated and likely to retain when you set your agenda. And again, by using material that's interesting to you, you learn without even really being aware. So, you know, so the implication really is that self-directed learning, which I think comes to no surprise to all of us here, because I think we all use it. Reward is better than threat. So as I said, the toward state is the ideal state for learning. You know, our motivation tends to be driven by moving away from something or moving that you don't want. And that can be motivating for some people. Sometimes it's necessary. You know, if you don't stop doing this, you're going to die. I mean, it can be in certain circumstances. But most of the time, the toward state is really a better way of you know, for learning. And again, as I said, it's your cognition is better, and you're more creative. You get those alpha brain waves. You know, and I mentioned that our brain tends to focus more on the negative. You know, if you're driving down the highway and there's a car accident, everyone tends to slow down to look at the car accident because we tend to be, you know, we gravitate. It's negative. Let me look at it. But no one slows down to look at a sunset. I've never seen anyone. Or the news is all negative because we're just wired, you know, to focus on the negative. I don't think it's a bad thing because we wouldn't have survived as a species. But now in the modern world, our brain doesn't know the difference. Our brain still thinks that some of these things are real threats, even though they're not. I'm going to talk about the social brain in a couple of slides from now, but things that aren't real threats for us, our brain thinks they are. So again, the idea is really to focus on, you know, on reward rather than threat. And again, this is related to the idea of what we call growth mindset versus fixed mindset. I'll give you an example. I think it sums it up nicely. A growth mindset, well, a fixed mindset is about, I have to prove myself to other people. I've got to prove to you. The growth mindset is about, I'm going to improve. I can improve. It's about basically, the fixed mindset is about, you know, I have fixed abilities. I succeeded because of my natural talent. Or I failed because, I don't know, I just don't have the language gene. Whereas the growth mindset is, you know, my abilities can increase as long as I practice. If I try, I can get better. It's you know, it's not just about my natural talent. It's about, you know, what I can do by trying. Growth mindset also basically could turn any situation into a learning experience. Yeah, I did in coaching. This comes up all the time. And when, you know, I coach people, we have their actions. A lot of times, people don't do their actions, and so, but that's a learning experience. It's like, oh, you didn't do them. That's fine. Okay, so what can we learn from this? What can we do differently next time? And you could kind of like reframe it. So any experience with a growth mindset can become a learning experience. And a lot of companies are trying to create this growth mindset throughout the, you know, the workforce because this is how companies succeed, by companies trying to cultivate a growth mindset. And again, I think there are probably a lot of practical implications for, you know, for language learning. It's very important to have a vision, you know, visualizing your success. You know, it sounds like a cliche, but it isn't. When I say vision, I mean where you want to go and what you want to achieve. And I think what happens with a lot of people is they confuse what they want or where they want to go, and they get that, and then they automatically think, but how am I going to get there? And they kind of, you know, the progress stops. It's interesting, there are two different brain systems for what and how. You can't think about both at the same time. So for example, in coaching, in the first coaching session with a client, we just focused just on the vision. We try to create a really, really powerful vision. So a vision that basically will get you up out of bed in the morning, you know. So for language learning, it could be, you know, what will it be like when I speak Mandarin Chinese at a B2 level? What will it be like, you know, when I can go to Berlin and I can actually talk with people? What will it be like when I can read Tolstoy in Russian? Whatever it is that makes you really excited, that's the vision. And I think it's something, vision is a visceral thing, it's emotive. It's really helpful when you're trying to define that vision to really focus on your senses. You know, when I'm doing that, what will I be doing in that moment? What will I hear? What will I feel? What will I smell? What will my body feel like? Those are things you can really, you know, I think one of the biggest problems with goal setting is people forget what the goal is. And that happens a lot of times. And if you can connect to that vision all the time, then that can really keep you on that journey. And again, focusing on the vision puts us in that toward state. We're moving towards something that we want. Take small steps every day. So every day is a small step towards your goal. Vision is that big, it's where I want to go. This is about how I'm going to get there. So, you know, if you imagine if this is my goal, I'm there, yes, I made it, you know, and I look back, and I ask myself, well, how did I get here? And I look at each of the milestones on my journey. Well, and if I look back, that was my strategy. I can actually define my strategy by imagining my future and then looking backwards. I can think about, how did I get there? It turns out that chunking down, breaking down a large goal into like smaller, manageable chunks that we can do in phases is a really good way of setting a goal and reaching it. Because by chunking something down, we can take something that seems really unreachable and we can make it feel manageable. It's also better for chunking learning down into doing a little bit every day is better for your memory. It's been shown that you know, studying a little bit every day for your long-term memory, it's much better than sporadic cram sessions. You know, the way we learn to study at school, many of us, is to pass an exam. But then forget a year later, 6 months later, we don't remember anything. It's because we studied to pass the exam. We crammed everything in. It doesn't stick into your memory that way. If you do a little bit every day, okay, then you're much more likely to create those long-term memories. It also allows for spaced repetition to really do its work. Because, you know, with spaced repetition, or just the spacing of learning, what you're allowing your brain to do is learn when you're sleeping, because your brain continues to work when you're sleeping. It continues to work when you're in a resting state. Your brain is always at work, and by the spacing it actually reinforces that. The forgetting is actually a good thing. Because when you forget something, you're forcing yourself to retrieve it. That reinforces that recall reinforces those circuits. I mentioned before, we want to have the right amount of stretch. I talked about the Goldilocks mix. So if we want to like achieve something really big, a major change in our lives, whether it's language learning or learning anything, we probably have to change some of our habitual way of doing things. That requires us to step out of our comfort zone. Not too much. You know, I think you have to be careful with the term comfort zone because I think sometimes it becomes weaponized. You know, you need to get out of your comfort zone. You know, if the person doesn't want to do it, it's like throwing someone into the deep end of the water. You have to do it in a way that's comfortable for you. You want just enough stretch, you know, like maybe listening to content that's a little bit above your level. You know, again, talking about the input hypothesis again. Just stretching, you challenge yourself a little bit every day. And finally, just be aware of the limbic response. You know, the brain is our brain perceives social pain the same way it perceives physical pain. This blew me away when I first discovered this, but it's actually a fact. If brain scans have showed that the same brain regions are activated when someone perceives a social threat as when they perceive physical pain. And so just being aware of that is important because it's not true that sticks and stones, sticks and stones actually, if the brain does not know the difference. This social pain is real. So if you're learning a language, that can generate social threat, right? I'm embarrassed to speak in front of people. I'm not good enough. I have an accent. Your brain thinks these are like real threats. And just being able to label that and recognizing that you're having this threat response gets your PFC involved, your prefrontal cortex, and it actually dampens down that limbic response. There are other things you can do. Feedback. This happens all the time. Studies have shown that most feedback either has no impact on the person receiving it, or it makes it worse. And the reason is because feedback creates a threat response, because all of us associate feedback as telling you what didn't work. So, my advice there basically would be, rather than giving people feedback, ask for it. How did I do? And also when you're giving people feedback, first focus on what they did right, and then you can focus on what they could change. It makes a lot more sense to focus on what you're doing right and do more of it. And how could you apply that somewhere else? Or being very careful with questions. Questions can create a threat response in someone, especially any question with the word why tends to put us in that kind of childlike explaining why we did something. Why didn't you do your homework? Oh, because, and so, questions, again, if you're a teacher or even for yourself, just be cognizant of the fact that questions can create especially closed questions, can create a threat response. So I think I'm done with the time. So, yeah, time for questions.
What an interesting subject. That is the brain, right? Yeah. So, we'll be taking a bunch of questions. Oh, yeah. Who was it again?
Thanks. Fantastic presentation.
Thanks.
And I just was wondering, do you have any resources or books on any of this stuff? I've heard of the Flow book. Ah, voila.
Yeah, Flow.
Is this stuff readable for a layperson?
I can't pronounce his name, so I'm sure one of you can, I'm sure, who did the flow state. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great book, by the way.
Hello?
Yeah.
I forget, how did that law, was it the neurons that fire together?
Hebbs Law.
Hebbs Law, neurons that fire together.
Wire together.
Wire together. I was wondering, how does that, or does that relate both positively and negatively to, what's that sports adage? Train as you play and you'll play as you train? Like, does that relate in any way to some way of thinking such as that? And if so, how would that apply to language learning, in your opinion?
Yeah, I haven't heard that one before. Train as they play, but train as you play and play as you train. Yeah. No, I think it relates because you're what you're doing is you're creating a very strong link between those two activities. So I think with language. So I think for learning examples. So if you can associate learning with a pleasurable experience or a pleasurable emotion, then I think that creates a link between I'm learning and I like doing this. So they tend to mutually reinforce one another. Or the same thing with with beliefs. If you associate a particular belief with a particular behavior, it's just the idea of two separate experiences, and the more you link them together, the more they become associated in your mind, because that's how the mind works. It forms associations between things. There are probably other examples. I think it depends for each one of us, but I really think it's about learning through making associations. For some people, the association could be musical; it could be a sound, all right? And for them, that works. For another, like some people say, don't translate; just look at pictures. That might work for some people, but might not work for others. In my viewpoint, they're all links you're making to some other information you have in your brain, right? Because you're always, anytime you learn something new, you're just linking it to existing material, and you're forming a new map, a new connection, a new way of associating those two things. So for some of us, it's going to be more visuals. For some of us, it's going to be more auditory. For some of us, it's going to be more through words. But I think it's that creating the link between those two things.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello. I'm being known as the question man right
Yeah, sure.
So, sorry, could you just go back maybe 6 or 7 slides?
Yeah.
I just had a particular question. Just keep going. That, no, next one maybe? Yeah, that one. What is that? Is that like fungus or something?
Oh, you can say it's a dog.
It's a dog?
It's a dog, giving a dog a bone.
Oh, a dog bone. Oh, okay.
Dog bone, yeah, I'm sorry.
I was super confused. I didn't know what
Yeah.
was going on there.
Sorry about that. Yeah, no, sorry. Well, it's good to know. Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, no fungus, no.
Okay.
It would be very motivating, would it?
Yeah. So my actual
yeah,
question, one of my favorite books of all time is Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. And in that book, he speaks about visualization,
Yeah.
much as you have in your presentation. But the whole book is honestly quite spiritual, and
Yeah.
it has to do with sort of connecting to the universe.
Yeah.
So I'm curious from a scientific perspective, what would you recommend visualization-wise? Because in the book, he recommends writing down a script and then reading that to yourself
Yeah.
every morning when you get out of bed.
Yeah.
And he gives a couple other tips. But what has been
Yeah.
neurologically proven to be the most effective method?
Well, again, I think it's like I said before, I think it depends on the person. You know, I think it's highly personalized because I talked about, no two brains being alike. So I really think you have to find the thing that's the most powerful for you and kind of trust that. I don't think there's any one thing. I don't think there's, there are a lot of different methods for visualization. I think you have to find the one that resonates the most with you. Because again, each one of us is unique. But I think any way of visualizing something so that it resonates, you're really able to, so it really motivates you, and you're able to remember it on a consistent basis. Anything, whatever work, I would just say trust yourself. I think to me that's when I heard about this, I was like, I really appreciate what experts say and tell me this is the best way of doing something. But my takeaway was really each one of us is unique, and we have to figure out what works for us. And the stuff that doesn't work for us, okay, well, you just got to trust yourself. Yeah.
Anyone else? Oh.
Mine's real quick. I just wanted to be sure, will your notes be posted on the Facebook page?
I can do that, sure.
Oh,
yeah,
thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the great content. So I wanted to ask, I liked your talk about making language learning less stressful and more fun and associating those pleasant sensations. So even though I absolutely love my language teacher, I find language lessons stressful.
Yeah.
What would you suggest?
Yeah. Well, may I ask, what do you find stressful about them?
Just the performance of I'm not going to get it right.
Yeah. So I would tend to think about maybe looking at that a little bit. What does it mean not to get it right? I'm not getting. First of all, just recognizing that you're feeling that you're having this response. You could even share that with your teacher. That I'm feeling this kind of pressure about getting it right. Because I think sometimes talking about it, when I start a coaching session with a client, we always start with this exercise called clearing the space, where we talk about what's going on in our minds that could distract us. And that could be something to talk about. I'm feeling all this pressure to get it right. And if you just put it out there on the table, that might actually help a lot. Sometimes just addressing it and giving it a name can, it might not go away 100%, but rather than pretend it's not there, if you just share it and talk about it and give it a name and just accept that it's there, it helps. Breathing exercises too. I mean, that's a whole other topic, but I think, I mentioned meditation, and I think that could be super helpful for getting you really present.
Or wine. Wine does help a lot.
Wine helps too. But your performance might fall off a bit, but that's it.
Mundolingo is very good for that. You get.
Yeah.
I learned Spanish by getting drunk with Mexicans. So.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Yeah.
So very interesting. Just I would appreciate, and of course all brains are different.
Yeah.
But I would appreciate sort of with your knowledge of the brain, some perspective on what happens in my brain when I react to certain things when I'm learning languages. So for example, I very much don't like to do any drills or exercises. If I have a book
Yeah.
you know, teach yourself or whatever, and they ask me questions, I just skip through it. I'm not interested. I don't like being put in a situation where I'm forced to think.
Yeah.
However, you're saying that you want to be able to produce the language that improves your retrieval, that improves, etc.
Yeah.
But I just find that I react very negatively. If I do flashcards, I put all the information on both sides. So I just want to flip through it. I don't want to rack my brain. Now, what is that? Is that sort of this threat response, or what's going on?
For you, I don't know. What I can tell you is I feel the same. I skip all that. I hate the exercises. I skip that. I don't do them either. For me, they put me in a threat state, right? Because it's telling me, you got to find the right answer. You have to produce it. It makes me feel like if I don't get the right answer, I'm not good enough. It's a status threat. That's a threat. I think what I was saying for the output was that. Maybe I didn't explain myself very well. Was that really, if it's forced output, I perceive it in the book as being forced output. I always skip those things because you're telling me you have to do this. It's like, no, I'm not going to do this. You're telling me, if you tell me I have to do it, I'm not going to do it. To me, that's forced output. I think the output would be whatever makes you. Maybe you heard the story and you read something really interesting and you want to share it with someone else, and that's output too. Or you just want to tell it. I don't know. Sometimes I talk to myself when I walk my dog. And for me, that's output. So I think it sounds to me like you have like a threat response. One of the threat responses also is there are different domains. One threat is autonomy. All of us basically can be rewarded or threatened in the domain of autonomy. To me, it sounds a little bit like autonomy, because what, this book is telling me what I have to do? It's like, no, it's not. It's like, I'll do what I want. So I can relate to it, yeah. Oh, yeah, sure.
All right, so towards the very end, you were saying something about about feedback not working or something. Maybe I misunderstood. It sounded like you were saying we should not correct people when they make mistakes.
Well, no, thanks for asking that. No, it wasn't so much correcting people with mistakes, but I ran out of time, so you're giving me thanks for asking. So basically, correcting people can create a threat response, right? So I think it's important to set the guidelines for correcting people, right? For example, first of all, asking permission. It's okay to correct you, and then clarifying. How would you like me to correct you? Do you want me to do it on the spot? Do you want me to correct all the mistakes? Do you want me to do it at the end? So it's not so much about, it's really getting permission from the person and creating kind of like guidelines of how it's going to work. So again, it kind of dampens down the threat response. You can really, but you might have a student that tells you, oh, I want you to correct me every time I make a mistake. As long as you both agree, I think that's fine. So it just really, just to be cognizant of the fact that anytime you're correcting someone, there's the potential for a threat response, and that could interfere with their performance. That's the basic idea. So there's no right answer to any of these things. It's really kind of like a dance that you're doing with your student, I think. Yeah.
All right. How about the last one?
So I just want to really second the plug for the Inner Game of Tennis. I actually read the book as a tennis player, and when I first started playing tennis about 7 years ago, I loved playing, I loved just practicing with people, and then I get into any kind of a competitive situation, I would just have a complete meltdown.
Yeah.
And I mean, the basic idea in the book is, you learn when you're not stressed, and then you try to get to the point where you're living in the moment, and when you're playing competitively, you let your body know what it needs to do. And then I started learning languages, and it's kind of the same thing. I mean, you want to be learning when it's fun, and you're not feeling threatened. And then when you get into situations where you need to use the language, you let your brain and your body do what it knows what to do already. And so this whole kind of threat thing is, if you feel pressured, you're not going to perform. And it's like in tennis, if it's the same thing with giving people suggestions. Like if you're playing doubles, and even to your partner, you tell them like, you did something really badly, or whatever, even not bad, like just you give them a tip or a suggestion, it's never going to work.
Right.
Like I've learned never to give my partner suggestions while we play, Because if they're trying to compete, they will not be able to, it all becomes artificial.
Yeah.
You can only learn kind of by repetition in a relaxed environment.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and then that touches, the self-directed learning again, too, because I think that we learn things when we figure them out ourselves. We don't learn when someone, gives us a tip. Again, our brains are unique, so that's why, when you give someone advice, most of the time they don't listen to it, because it probably is good advice that I'm giving you, but it's good for me, it's not good for you. It's a lot more helpful if I can help you to figure out what's going to work for you, and only you know the answer to that. So I think to me, that's what comes to mind. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thanks.